Now, we looked at the terrible situation in the Middle East last night. The death toll has continued to rise, with at least 56 people killed now. Most of them have been killed in Gaza, and at least half of them are claimed to be Hamas terrorists, so we can spare our sympathies there. What we do deplore is the horrible taking of innocent lives. But as ever, there are two fundamental distinctions between the fighting and the responses in this latest flare-up of age-old enmities. First is the point of instigation, that is, who started the violence. And the instigator here, again, has been the Hamas terrorists in Gaza, firing hundreds of rockets into Israel. And second, and even more importantly and clear-cut, is the targeting issue. Hamas aim their rockets clearly and unashamedly at civilians. Their aim is simply to kill and terrorise Israelis. This week, their rockets have even killed Arab Israelis. This reckless and heartless targeting of civilians is the very definition of terrorism. Israel, on the other hand, for all its sophisticated and powerful weaponry, targets the terrorists. It goes so far as to warn Palestinians in Gaza what buildings it will hit and why, so that innocents can escape ahead of the bombardment. It claims to have killed many terrorists and a handful of Hamas leaders in recent days. But, and this is terrible of course, some of those killed in Israel too and in Gaza undoubtedly are innocents. This is tragic and senseless. But for Hamas to protect Palestinian civilians, all it needs to do is stop firing rockets at Israeli towns and suburbs. Here's a video put out by the Israeli Defence Forces to explain to the rest of the world why they're defending themselves. Now, just to be clear, that is the Israeli argument. That is their video. It's pretty compelling, I reckon, but obviously you can make up your own mind. Much of what you see in the media, on the other hand, reflects Palestinian propaganda, by the way. And the false moral equivalence we get on this issue is always sickening. And sadly, these hatreds play out even in our own country. A woman was arrested for burning the Israeli flag in Sydney's Lakemba last night. But what about this from the New South Wales Labor leader, JODI MCKAY? She tweeted that she was thinking of the Palestinian community on the eve of Eid. I know they're worried about friends and family in Jerusalem and Gaza. Attacks on the innocent and on places of worship are unacceptable. Now, of course, we sympathise with the Palestinian community, and of course, attacks on the innocent are wrong. But how does this sort of one-sided sentiment help anyone, especially when it obviously seeks to portray Israel as the aggressor and the Palestinians as the victims? Australian lawyer Arsen Ostrowski responded on Twitter from Tel Aviv with a picture. Hi Jodi, I'm an Australian from Sydney, currently in Israel. This was me at 3:30 in the morning, cradling my baby in a makeshift bomb shelter after Palestinian terrorists in Gaza fired rockets, a barrage of rockets, over 1,000 in 24 hours. Are you thinking also of us? This is a very good question. I'll cross to Arsen in Israel later in the program. Another response came from Rolene Marks. Hi Jodi, 3 synagogues were set on fire by mobs in Israel last night. Is that unacceptable too? This while we ran for shelter as hundreds of rockets rained down on us. Again, a good question. Well, what about this point also made in response to MCKAY on Twitter? And the 200 rockets that Palestine fired into Israel? There is massive wrong on both sides, but Hamas is a terrorist group who wants to wipe Israel off the map. That is true, and it matters. False moral equivalence helps no one except the terrorists. And have a listen to this news report on Australia's own ABC. Even a taxpayer-funded journalist sent to cover these events at our expense, supposedly covering them objectively for Australian audiences. Even he portrays Israel as the aggressor.
hundreds of bombs have caused hundreds of injuries.
إذا بدهم يصعدوا المقاومة جاهزة.
If they want to escalate, the resistance is ready. If they want to stop, the resistance is also ready.
In retaliation, Hamas and other militant groups fired hundreds of rockets into Israel.
Hamas was retaliating? Really? Terrorists targeting civilians in Israel are the ones who were triggered into action by Israeli bombings? This is your tax dollars at work, feeding propaganda, news reports containing the complete reverse, the complete opposite of the objective reality. Let's cross to the Sydney CBD now and catch up with Dr. David Adler, who's the president of the Australian Jewish Association. Firstly, David, you must be so concerned about the situation there. We haven't seen it this bad for almost a decade, since about 2014. What hope do you have that cooler heads will prevail and there won't be any sort of a land incursion, an Israeli troop movement on the ground into Gaza?
Chris, good afternoon. Your summary is very accurate, and at the moment things look like they are escalating. One of the factors which hasn't had enough focus is that there was to be an election in the Palestinian Authority. The president of the PA, Mahmoud Abbas, is in his 17th year of a 4-year term, and he promised elections this year. They were cancelled. They were cancelled because all the polling showed that had an election proceeded, Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad would be victors. One of the factors happening here is actually a power play between the different forces trying to represent the Arab Palestinians for control. And how do they exert control? They exert control by trying to be the primary violence dominator. So at the moment, it's not looking good.
We've also had a period where we've had a US president who was firmly on the side of Israel's right to exist. Now we've got a president who's equivocating, so they're testing out the new president. What about the Australian result, the Australian response here, David? This false equivalence, I've shown the example from JODI, MCKAY and from the ABC. They're always portraying Israel as the aggressor, even though it is Israel responding to rocket attacks.
Well, the first observation I'd make about JODI MCKAY is she's a state member of parliament. So a state member of parliament commenting on a foreign policy issue, attributing causation in a foreign policy issue immediately raises questions. At best, it's grossly ignorant and biased, her statement. There are no Israeli attacks on innocent civilians and places of worship, as she alleges. What happens in reality is that Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad intentionally station rockets and other infrastructure in residential areas. And Hamas even have a headquarters in the basement of a hospital. They're using their own civilians as human shields. And as you've said, Israel goes to great lengths to try to minimise civilian casualties. But in targeting the terrorists and their infrastructure, occasionally there is going to be, unfortunately and regrettably, civilians injured and sometimes killed.
Well, it's tragic and it's complex, yet we have an Australian reporter sent there by our public broadcaster, and he portrays it as Hamas responding to Israeli aggression. I mean, that's the opposite to what's occurred here.
It is indeed a moral inversion, a complete moral inversion. Australia actually still gives something in the order of $35 million of aid in the budget called the Palestinian territories. Now, one of the observations I'd ask your viewers to make is they've obviously got money and tens of millions of dollars to fire approximately 1,500 rockets into Israel, but they'll come hand out asking us for money for example, coronavirus vaccines.
Yeah, indeed, indeed. And we have that debate. I better move on. Thanks for joining us, David. A shocking situation.
Thank you, Chris.
David Adler there from the Australian Jewish Association. Shocking situation. Got to pick our way through it. But you've got to start with the facts. You can't invent your own facts.